1868, Italy. The choirboys who died singing the same note. The Caltanissetta mystery, it began with a single note. A note so pure, so steady, it seemed to pierce through the ancient stone walls of the Caltanissetta Cathedral. The voices of the choirboys rose together, filling the cold September air with music meant to honor God. But in the midst of that harmony, something broke. One by one, their voices faltered. The melody collapsed, and when the echoes faded, silence remained because several of the boys lay lifeless on the cathedral floor. The hymn had ended, but the nightmare had just begun. The year was 1868, and Italy was still healing from war and revolution. In towns like Caltanissetta, perched in the heart of Sicily, life was marked by poverty and devotion. Families clung to faith, and children were often given to the church as choir boys, symbols of purity, voices meant to carry prayers into heaven. That September, a special service was held. Candles flickered along the aisles. The scent of incense clung to the air, heavy and sweet. The pews were filled with townspeople, their eyes drawn upward to the boys dressed in white robes, their angelic voices rising in unison. But what happened next would forever scar the town's history. Witnesses claimed it was as though an unseen hand had struck them all at once. Mid-song, a handful of boys clutched their throats, staggered, and collapsed. Some gasped for breath, others convulsed. A few fell silent instantly, their bodies motionless under candlelight. The congregation erupted in panic. Mothers screamed. Priests rushed forward, tried to lift the children, whispering frantic prayers as if words could pull them back from the brink. But it was too late. Outside the cathedral, bells rang, not for celebration, but for death. The sound carried across narrow streets, echoing through alleys where merchants, beggars, and travelers paused in disbelief. News spread like wildfire. The choir boys had died singing. No one understood. No illness had been declared in the town. No poison had been seen. Yet somehow, healthy boys had walked into the cathedral, sung a sacred hymn, and never walked out alive. In the hours that followed, the cathedral became a place of horror. Candles continued to burn as their small bodies were laid out in rows. Parents pressed against the doors, begging to be let inside, only to be met with the cries of the priests who struggled to explain the unexplainable. Some whispered it was a punishment from God, retribution for hidden sins within the town. Others swore it was the work of plague, the same silent killer that had haunted Sicily in decades past. A darker few suspected foul play, whispers of poison or cursed incense rising with each retelling. The truth, however, remained locked in shadows. What made the tragedy unforgettable was not only the number of children lost, but the eerie detail that many of them died on the same note. Mouths still open in song, breath cut short mid-hymn. The townspeople would later call it the death note. And as the sun set over Caltanissetta that evening, the streets fell into an unnatural quiet. No laughter, no bells, only silence, thick, suffocating, and filled with questions that no priest, doctor, or grieving parent could answer. But the mystery was far from over. The cathedral should have been a sanctuary, a place where voices rose in praise and hearts found peace. But after that night, in 1868, its walls carried only whispers. Shadows clung to the corners. Stained glass windows, once vibrant with color, seemed colder. Every flicker of candlelight felt like an omen. The people of Caltanissetta avoided walking too close to the church at night, as if the building itself had swallowed the boys' last breath. Inside, the priests worked in silence, their faces pale, their robes heavy with incense and grief. They moved quickly to cover the bodies, lining them beneath white cloths as though shielding them from curious eyes. Yet nothing could hide the horror. Some claimed they heard the faint sound of singing even after the deaths, an echo of the hymn that had turned to tragedy. A chilling illusion, perhaps, or something darker. Mothers insisted the voices belonged to their children, still calling out from the stone walls. The cathedral's reputation shifted overnight. For centuries, it had been a place of worship, but now it became a place of fear. Parishioners prayed more fervently, yet fewer dared to enter. Families whispered of curses, of sins unconfessed, of spirits unsettled. And at the heart of it all stood the choir loft, the place where the boys had collapsed. Parishioners avoided looking toward it during Mass. Children cried when their parents dragged them to church. Some said the loft remained colder than the rest of the building, no matter how bright the sun shone outside. The priests themselves were divided. Some argued the deaths were divine punishment, a warning to the town for straying from faith. They thundered from the pulpit about repentance, urging confession and sacrifice. Others sought earthly answers. They questioned the incense burned that night, the oil in the lamps, even the wine used in the service. But these investigations were carried out quietly, behind locked doors, for fear of scandal. If the cathedral was to remain a house of God, the truth had to be controlled. Still, rumors escaped. Townspeople whispered that the priest had destroyed evidence, scraping wax from the altar, throwing out incense, scrubbing blood from the choir loft. It was said one young cleric went mad after the tragedy, confessing to visions of the boys standing beside the altar, their faces pale, their lips moving silently, as if still singing. Others believed darker forces had taken root. Tales of demonic presence began to surface, of a shadow that passed along the pews that night, just before the boys collapsed. The more the church tried to suppress such talk, the stronger the stories grew. To this day, some say the Cathedral of Caltanissetta carries a stain that no prayer can wash away. The flicker of a candle throws too many shadows. The echo of a hymn lingers too long. And when the wind moves just right through the stone arches, it sounds as though children are still singing, forever trapped on the note that killed them. But the story of the Choirboys is not only about a haunted cathedral. It is also about the lives they lived, the faces they left behind, and the dreams that vanished in a single night. They were only children, boys who should have been chasing each other in the dusty Sicilian streets, laughing, trading marbles, stealing figs from the marketplace. Instead, they wore white robes and carried the weight of angelic expectation. Their voices, delicate yet powerful, became the pride of Caltanissetta. But behind the music lay hunger, poverty, and sacrifice. In 1868, Sicily was no place for the weak. Families lived hand-to-mouth, relying on bread, olives, and hope. Many fathers worked in sulfur mines, descending into choking darkness each day, their lungs coated with poison dust. Mothers took in sewing or scrubbed floors for the wealthier families of town. The church offered escape. Choir service meant food, shelter, and a kind of honor. A son who sang for God could bring pride to his family, even if it meant his life was tied to discipline and duty. So parents gave their children to the cathedral. And the children, some only 6 or 7 years old, learned to breathe in rhythm, to stand perfectly still, to lift their voices in unison until they sounded like angels. The Choirboys became known throughout the region. Travelers spoke of their voices, of how the cathedral seemed to glow when their hymns soared. But behind the scenes, the boys were ordinary, mischievous, restless, fragile. At night, in their dormitories, they whispered secrets. Some dreamed of becoming priests. Others longed to run away, to join sailors or soldiers, to see the world beyond the narrow stone streets of Caltanissetta. They were children pulled between obedience and the wild ache of freedom. One boy, remembered in faded church records, had written a line of poetry before his death. "When we sing, I feel the sky open." Those words would later haunt his mother, who repeated them again and again as if they were a prophecy fulfilled too soon. The tragedy struck hardest because these were not nameless children. Each boy carried a story, a family, a life cut short. One had been his mother's only child. Another had worked the mines beside his father before being chosen for the choir. Yet another was said to have the purest voice in all of Sicily, so clear it made grown men weep. And they all fell together, as if tied by fate. After their deaths, families clashed with the church. Some demanded answers. Others demanded the return of their sons' bodies, though the cathedral resisted, fearing what might be found if outside doctors examined them. Mothers tore at their clothes in the streets. Fathers cursed the heavens. Siblings sat in silence, refusing food. For the town, the loss was more than personal grief. It was collective devastation. The choir had been the pride of Caltanissetta. Now it was its shame, its burden, its unanswered mystery. The people began to see the boys not only as victims, but as martyrs. Tiny saints who had died with voices lifted toward God. Candles were lit at their graves. Songs were written about them. Even as grief tore families apart, a kind of legend began to grow. Yet beneath the prayers and the hymns, one question refused to die. Why them? Why did children, innocent and pure, collapse mid-song? Why did the church hide more than it revealed? And what secret, if uncovered, could change the story of that night forever? The night began like any other mass. The air was thick with incense, curling and slow, ghostly ribbons toward the vaulted ceiling. Oil lamps glowed faintly, throwing long shadows across the stone arches. Outside, a soft drizzle tapped against the cathedral windows, as if the heavens themselves were listening. The boys stood in their robes, pale faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. They inhaled deeply, waiting for the conductor's hand to rise. And then it began. The hymn was solemn, an old Latin prayer sung for centuries. At first, the sound was flawless, a wave of voices cascading over the congregation. Townspeople closed their eyes, some weeping quietly, overwhelmed by the beauty. But then on a single, steady note, something changed. One boy faltered. His voice cracked. He clutched his chest. A second boy gasped, his hymn breaking midword. Then another, and another. The music collapsed into chaos. Screams filled the cathedral as children dropped where they stood. Their small bodies trembled, some writhing as though seized by invisible hands. Others froze, eyes wide, lips still parted in song, breath stolen away in an instant. Panic erupted in the pews. Mothers rushed forward, skirts trailing across the stone floor. Fathers shouted at priests to do something, anything. Priests scrambled, lifting limp bodies, fanning them, pressing holy water to their lips. But nothing worked. Witnesses would later swear that many of the boys died on the very same note, the final note they had been instructed to hold. Their mouths hung open, their throats rigid, their eyes staring upward as though still singing to a God who would not answer. That image seared itself into the memory of every witness. The congregation fled the cathedral in horror, spilling into the rain-soaked streets. The bells began to toll, not in rhythm with the hymn, but in heavy, uneven strokes of dread. The sound carried across the town. Something terrible had happened inside the house of God. By midnight, the cathedral was sealed. Heavy wooden doors shut tight, guarded by priests who refused entry. Inside, the flickering candles burned lower, their smoke mixing with the scent of fear. The choir loft, once filled with angelic sound, stood silent except for the rustle of robes and the low sobbing of clerics who had witnessed the unthinkable. No one slept that night. Families gathered in their homes, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers. Others cursed the church, certain that incense or wine had been poisoned. A few, darker in thought, whispered of demons, of Satan himself stealing voices meant for heaven. But for the parents who lost children, explanations did not matter. They would never forget the sight of small hands falling limp, of pale faces frozen mid-song. They would never forget the silence that followed, heavier than stone, heavier than grief itself. The night of the death note was not just a tragedy. It was an ending of innocence, of trust, of faith in the very place meant to protect their sons. And yet, it was only the beginning of a deeper mystery. The morning after the tragedy, Caltanissetta awoke to a sound more chilling than silence, the toll of funeral bells. They rang again and again, echoing through cobblestone streets and sulfur-stained hills. Women wept openly in doorways. Men walked with heads bowed, their faces carved in disbelief. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, asking questions no parent could answer. The town had seen death before. Disease, mining accidents, famine. But this was different. This was sacred innocence stolen within the house of God. The cathedral doors remained locked. The church insisted it was for reverence, for cleansing, for prayers. But people whispered it was to hide the bodies. Mothers pleaded to see their sons one last time. Some pressed their faces against the cold stone, listening for voices they would never hear again. In the marketplace, conversations fell to hushed tones. Shopkeepers crossed themselves each time they passed the church. Bread was sold in silence. Even the cries of street vendors softened, as if shouting would offend the dead. The tragedy had not only taken lives, it had stolen the rhythm of daily life. When at last the church allowed a procession, the sight broke the town in half. Small coffins, dozens of them, lined the streets. White flowers were draped over the lids, but nothing could disguise how small they were. Mothers collapsed at the sight, screaming their sons' names. Fathers clenched their fists until their knuckles bled. The bells tolled with every step of the procession. Priests intoned Latin prayers, their voices hollow, as though even they no longer believed their own words. Behind them, the people of Caltanissetta followed in silence, the entire town moving as one body of grief. At the burial ground, the earth opened wide to receive them. Some families begged for private graves, but the church refused. The boys were laid side by side, a single trench of innocence lowered into the soil. Priests said it was fitting that they had sung together, and so they should rest together. But for the parents, it was unbearable. One mother threw herself into the grave, clutching at her son's coffin until others dragged her away. Another collapsed on the earth, whispering, "I hear him still. I hear him still." After that day, the town seemed forever cloaked in mourning. Curtains stayed drawn. Weddings were postponed. The laughter of children vanished from streets. The tragedy became a wound that would not close, an open sore on the soul of Caltanissetta. The cathedral, once the proud heart of the town, now loomed like a tomb. Each time its bells rang, people flinched. Few dared to enter its doors. Some families abandoned their faith entirely, convinced that God had turned against them. But grief soon gave way to anger. Whispers of blame spread through the streets like fire. Was it the priests, hiding something from the townspeople? Was it poison, carried through the incense or the communion wine? Or was it something more sinister, a curse that had crept into holy ground? The answers were nowhere to be found. But one thing was certain, Caltanissetta would never be the same. The town had buried its choirboys, but could not bury the questions that lingered over their graves. When grief turned to questions, the cathedral could no longer remain silent. The town demanded answers. Families pleaded. Rumors spread like wildfire, threatening to consume what little trust remained. And so, reluctantly, the priests allowed doctors to examine the tragedy. But the collaboration between faith and science was uneasy, hostile even. The doctors came armed with their instruments, their ink-stained notebooks, their rational explanations. They believed in illness, contagion, poison, things of the flesh, not the soul. The priests, on the other hand, spoke of sin and punishment, of mysteries not meant for human understanding. To them, probing the bodies of the dead was an act of desecration, an insult to God's will. Still, the pressure was too great. Something had to be done. By lamplight, in the cold silence of the sacristy, examinations were carried out in secret. The air smelled of incense and death. Doctors bent over the small bodies, searching for signs, lesions, swelling, discoloration. Their gloved hands trembled, not from inexperience, but from the weight of dozens of tiny corpses laid out before them. The priests stood nearby, watching with narrowed eyes, whispering prayers under their breath as if to ward off sacrilege. But the doctors found little. The boys' lungs were clear. Their skin bore no rash. Their stomachs revealed no obvious poison. No plague, no calere, no pestilence. It was as though life had simply been stolen in a single breath. Frustration grew. The doctors accused the priests of withholding information. Had new incense been used that night? Was the wine tainted? Had the oil in the lamps released deadly fumes? Each question was met with denial, evasion, or silence. The priests, in turn, accused the doctors of blasphemy. They claimed science sought to strip away the hand of God, to turn divine punishment into mere accident. They spoke of the dangers of human pride, of men who thought they could outsmart heaven. The clash was not only about the boys. It was about truth itself. One young doctor, only recently graduated from Palermo, swore he detected the faint smell of sulfur in the cathedral loft. He suggested fumes from the mines had somehow seeped into the chamber, poisoning the air. The priests silenced him immediately. To admit such a cause would draw blame on the powerful mining companies, men who funded the very church in which the boys had died. Another physician insisted the incense had been laced with something unfamiliar, something toxic. But when samples were requested, the incense was gone, burned away, or disposed of by unseen hands. Evidence slipped through their fingers like smoke. In the end, no official conclusion was reached. The doctors left frustrated, their findings vague, their reputations on the line. The priests emerged with their authority intact, declaring the tragedy a mystery of God, not meant to be solved by mortal men. But for the families, the clash between doctors and priests solved nothing. Their children were still gone. The graves were still fresh. And the truth, whatever it was, remained buried deeper than the coffins themselves. When truth is silenced, rumors speak louder. In the weeks after the Choirboys' deaths, Caltanissetta became a furnace of speculation. Every alley carried a different story. Every whisper grew sharper with retelling. What began as questions soon turned into accusations and fear. Some swore it was poison. They spoke of tainted incense brought from Palermo, its smoke curling through the cathedral like invisible knives. Others believed the communion wine had been spoiled, corrupted before the service began. A few even pointed fingers at rival families within the town, suggesting vengeance had seeped into holy ground. But if poison was the answer, why had only the boys been struck down? Why not the priests? Why not the congregation? The question lingered like a shadow no one could banish. Others insisted it was plague. Whispers of contagion terrified the people, memories of past epidemics rising like ghosts. Merchants claimed to have seen rats fleeing the cathedral the very night of the tragedy. Mothers feared sending their children outdoors, believing invisible sickness still clung to the air. But when no one else in the town fell ill, the rumor of plague faded into silence, only to be replaced by something darker. The most chilling rumor was that it had been punishment from God. Priests, careful with their words, suggested as much in sermons. The boys, they claimed, had been chosen as examples. Perhaps sins of the town had drawn divine wrath. Perhaps someone had broken a vow, defiled a sacred oath, or harbored hidden heresy. The thought spread like fire through dry grass. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Families accused families. The air grew heavy with guilt and fear, as though every soul carried the weight of the deaths. Yet not all agreed with the priests. In taverns and markets, braver voices muttered that the church itself was to blame. Some claimed the cathedral was cursed, built on unholy ground. Others accused the priests of negligence, or worse, of hiding secrets too dangerous to confess. One rumor struck hardest of all, that the boys had not simply collapsed, but had been silenced, that someone inside the cathedral had wanted them gone. Whispers of ritual sacrifice crawled through the town, muttered in dark corners, never spoken aloud in daylight. As weeks turned to months, the truth seemed further away than ever. The people of Caltanissetta no longer knew what to believe. Was it poison, plague, punishment, or something unthinkable, a crime woven into the very heart of their faith? No matter the theory, one fact could not be erased. Dozens of choir boys entered the cathedral alive, and they never came out. The rumors, like the tragedy itself, became part of the town's blood. And for the families left behind, every whisper was another wound that refused to heal. Grief does not end at the grave. It lingers. It transforms. It consumes. For the families of the choir boys, life after the tragedy was a shadow of what it had once been. Their homes echoed with absence. Their tables sat half empty. Their streets felt colder, as though the town itself had lost its heartbeat. Mothers carried the heaviest burden. Some refused to leave their homes, their voices gone hoarse from nights of weeping. Others haunted the cathedral steps, pressing rosaries to their lips until their fingers bled. One woman was seen wandering the marketplace every morning, calling her son's name as though he were simply lost among the stalls. Fathers grieved differently. They worked in silence, their faces turned to stone. Some buried themselves in the sulfur mines, laboring until exhaustion drowned their thoughts. Others turned to drink, staggering through the streets with hollow eyes. A few took their rage out on the church, shouting at priests during Mass, demanding answers that would never come. The siblings of the choir boys carried scars too. Children who had once played freely in the streets now kept to themselves. They avoided laughter, as though joy would dishonor the dead. Some whispered to their friends that they could still hear their brothers singing in the night. Others sat awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps that would never return. The tragedy stretched like a chain across every family, linking them together in sorrow. And yet, grief turned to something else. For some families, it became devotion. They treated their sons as martyrs, lighting candles every evening, speaking of them as saints who had gone to God in song. They believed their voices still filled heaven, that their loss carried purpose. But for others, grief turned to hatred. Hatred for the priests who had silenced the truth. Hatred for a God who had allowed it. Hatred for a world where innocence could be stolen without reason. The town split in two, faithful mourners and bitter skeptics. Neither could heal, and neither could forgive. Years later, some families left Caltanissetta altogether. They could not bear to see the cathedral, the graves, the streets where their sons had once played. They carried their sorrow with them, telling the story to strangers in distant towns. The tragedy traveled with them, spreading the shadow of the death note beyond Sicily. But most stayed, bound to the soil where their children rested. They aged with grief carved into their faces, their eyes always drifting toward the cathedral when the bells rang. The tragedy of the choir boys was not just the loss of young lives. It was the silence left behind in every home, the echo of laughter that would never return, the unbearable emptiness of a mother's arms. And though decades passed, though generations turned, the families of Caltanissetta carried that silence like an inheritance, a sorrow passed from parent to child, a story told in whispers, a wound that time refused to close. The cathedral stood tall, its bells tolling as if nothing had happened. But beneath its stone walls, secrets festered. The priests locked away records, sealed documents, and ordered silence. What little the doctors had written mysteriously disappeared. And when townspeople pressed too hard for answers, they were met with sermons about faith, obedience, and the dangers of questioning God's will. Yet whispers persisted, because silence always breeds suspicion. Some claimed the church had destroyed the evidence. The robes worn by the boys were said to have been burned in secret. The incense censers polished until no trace remained. Even the choir loft itself was scrubbed and repainted, as though holy water could erase the blood and terror that had stained it. Others swore there had been a hidden letter, a confession written by one of the priests, admitting what truly happened that night. But if it existed, it never reached the people. The church, with its wealth and power, had buried it deeper than any grave. The stones themselves seemed to hold the truth. Visitors to the cathedral spoke of strange marks near the choir loft, scratches on the wood as though small fingers had clawed for breath. Some saw faint stains on the stone steps that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Candlelight flickered strangely in the loft, shadows moving where no one stood. To the faithful, these were signs of martyrdom. To the fearful, they were signs of haunting. As decades passed, the story of the choir boys became half memory, half legend. Records blurred, testimonies twisted, but one truth remained. The church never gave a full explanation. Why did so many die at once? Why were the coffins buried together, without independent investigation? Why was every attempt at inquiry met with silence or destruction? The cathedral became both monument and prison. Its stones stood as silent witnesses, carrying a truth that human lips refused to speak. Even now, locals say that at night, if you stand near the cathedral doors, you can hear faint voices. A chorus of boys holding one long, mournful note. Some say it is the sound of innocence demanding justice. Others believe it is a warning, an echo of what happens when secrets are buried too deep. The truth may never have been written in books, but it was carved into stone, and stone remembers. More than 150 years have passed since the Choirboys of Caltanissetta sang their final note. Yet the mystery has never been solved. Historians pore over faded archives, but the documents are incomplete. Priests guarded their silence until the grave. Families carried their grief into future generations, telling the story in hushed tones at kitchen tables, their voices heavy with sorrow and suspicion. The truth remains just beyond reach, like a hymn half forgotten. Some modern scholars argue that the boys may have been victims of toxic fumes, sulfur rising from the mines beneath the town, seeping into the cathedral at just the wrong moment. Others suggest contaminated incense, laced unknowingly with deadly chemicals. But no theory explains why the deaths struck with such precision, why so many collapsed at the same instant, on the same note, in the same place. That eerie detail is what keeps the story alive. To the people of Caltanissetta, the tragedy has become something more than history. It is legend, a tale parents still whisper to their children when warning them about obedience or the dangers of unanswered faith. A story woven into the fabric of the town, carried in every toll of the bells. Tourists come, drawn by the haunting, the mystery, the promise of standing where the boys once sang. They wander the cathedral, staring at the choir loft, wondering if the air still carries traces of that fatal night. Some leave with chills, swearing they felt a presence. Others dismiss it as superstition, but none leave untouched. And so, the story endures. The Choirboys of Caltanissetta never grew up. They never left behind songs of their own making, never found love, never built lives beyond their hymnals. They remain forever frozen in time, children locked on a single, eternal note, a note that echoes still, in the stones of the cathedral, in the silence of the graves, in the hearts of a town that never forgot. Perhaps the truth will never surface. Perhaps it is better that way. But one question will always linger. Were those boys singing to God, or crying out to us, across centuries, to finally uncover the secret of their last breath?